Welcome to the Booktopia podcast. I'm Ben Hunter, Booktopia's fiction category manager. This is a podcast about books and the brilliant people who read them and write them. I'm recording from home today, my house on Gadigal land. I want to pay respects to elders past, present, emerging. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Today's guest I'm very excited for. It's Tilly Lawless. Tilly Lawless is a queer Sydney-based sex worker who uses her online platform to destigmatize sex work and advocate for decriminalisation and better protections under the law for sex workers everywhere. Her debut novel is astonishing. It's called Nothing But My Body. Tilly Lawless, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
My pleasure. It's nice to have something to do in lockdown.
Good. Let's dive into this brilliant book. There's this huge sense of flow in this novel. It's really different, and it, for me, reading it arrests my expectations right away. You wiggle between depression and elation and tenderness and being really visceral and sharp. I guess I want to know at the outset, like, what kind of headspace were you in when you wrote this thing?
Oh God, I mean, I wrote it in lockdown. I wrote it from March, September last year. So I think a lot of the things that I was missing really came through in it. So like physical spaces and like being able to touch friends and things like that was really, I think that's probably why it was so visceral and so tied to the body, because I became like hyper aware of being isolated and not being able to have my body engage with people in the ways that it usually did. So that definitely influenced it. I will say that I had the concept for it before we went into lockdown, like before I had any idea of like the kind of havoc that the pandemic was going to like wreak on our lives. And so like the concept of like the fluctuations in the like mental states and emotions, as you mentioned, was an idea I'd had earlier in 2020. And it was actually an idea that I got from Mrs. Dalloway.
Right.
Yeah, because you know how, like, obviously, and I mean, I haven't read that since a teenager, but I remember it really clearly reading as a teenager. And obviously, you know, it's like one woman's train of thought across like a concentrated period of time as she's going about doing her daily life, you know, like getting ready for a dinner party or whatever. And I really like the way her, you know, internal world like interacted with the external world, you know, like she's thinking about how she's going to decorate the room for this dinner party, and she's thinking of who gave her a vase, and it's like taking her back into her memory. And so like that was what inspired the structure. And then I was like, oh well, like, why don't I do it across? It was originally meant to be across a week, because like a week just gave me.
And then you got to 8 days.
Well, yeah, I wrote 7 days, and then the 7th day was too depressing, and I was like, I can't finish like that. So I wrote another day. And I also wanted to show that like the sort of inevitable fluctuation continued indefinitely, like outside any sort of like time bracket that you might put it within, you know.
It's 8 days, but it's also like a year and a bit. And it picks up like all this stuff from our contemporary context. The lockdown happens, the bushfire season happens. It's so contemporary, and it's really immediate and urgent as a result of that. I love this book. The character in this novel at the outset, she's at a breaking point with a failing relationship with a woman that the reader never meets. She's like obsessive and she's unwell, and she finds solace in, I don't know if solace is the right word, but I'm going to use it. She finds solace in sex work as a distraction from the distresses of her life, which is a flip to how she normally operates, which, you know, I think about that. And for most people who kind of work in the capitalist system, the monotony of work can be a solace, right?
Definitely.
And I want to ask you, has sex work ever been a refuge or a solace for you at any stage?
Oh, definitely. I think what
and
you just said about
what is it that you miss during lockdown?
Oh, wow. Okay, so to answer the first bit, yes, it definitely has. And I think what you said about the monotony of work sometimes being an escape is really important, because I think we often just like discount the importance of having like routine and structure in our days. And I think when you're really unwell, like work can either be one of two things. Like it can either remind you of how unwell you are because you feel like you can't even function in your workspace, and that's like the worst, or it can give you structure and distraction that you wouldn't have otherwise. So sex work definitely has been that for me at points. And that is something that, I mean, obviously this lockdown round feels so much worse than last year's lockdown, because I feel like last year it was kind of like almost like exciting chaos. As like awful and distressing as it was, the whole world was in it. We were all like, what's going to happen? You know, like there was like almost an adrenaline to it, you know? And like, whereas I feel like this year's lockdown doesn't have that at all, because A, we shouldn't be in it, you know, like it's all the result of the fucking vaccine rollout. And B, there's no longer an excitement to it. Like this is, you know, coronavirus has been around for, you know, coming up to 2 years now, and it's actually just really depressing. So yeah, I'm very, very much missing the connection that work brought me, you know, like the connection with other women. Like I miss a lot of the girls I work with at the brothel, because they are women that I don't have relationships with outside of the brothel, you know. And I also do miss the physical touch the work brings me. Like even though a lot of the time like I can resent the clients or like not want to be touched in that moment, now that I'm completely without touch, I realize that it kind of, sex work has me at this sort of like base level of contact with people, you know. And that's just gone.
So what support is there for sex workers during the lockdown? Is there any?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm lucky in that I'm able to get on Centrelink, like the disaster payment, because I'm unable to work. So, but like obviously there are plenty of you know, like especially migrant workers who, you know, don't have access to Centrelink, or, you know, people who are studying who like can't get on the disaster payment because they're already on Oz Study or whatever. Like there's a whole gap in people, as we know, that have been like missed by the government. But theoretically, if you're a sex worker who's a citizen, you can get on the payment right now. Yeah.
Well, that's something. Because you think about it, the sex industry is just overlooked in kind of broader movements in workers' rights, and unions and the Labour Party have just always been run by white men, and often Catholic white men. So they just get discounted. And a lot of your work also talks about how mainstream feminism or mainstream queer rights also discounts sex workers. Why is that? Do you think?
Oh God, I mean, with feminism, it's often that's really tied to second wave feminism, which obviously had the concept of women needed to reject traditional roles, you know? So like a traditional role might be being a housewife, and they also saw a lot of femininity of women as like trappings of the patriarchy. So, you know, like makeup or bras or like things like that. And unfortunately, that attitude has carried on. You know, you talk about like the huge wars between like sex positive feminists and anti-porn feminists, like through like the 70s and 80s and 90s. And that's something that has like continued on into the debates around sex work. So like, unfortunately, a lot of feminists see sex work as just a way of being a slave to the patriarchy. And with queer stuff, it's a little bit more complicated, because with queer, with like the queer world, often you have people who are trying to argue acceptance from the straight world based on the fact that they're respectable, and so they want to say that, like, I have a normal job and I pay tax and blah blah blah. And so unfortunately sex work is something that they feel smears the acceptability of like gay people. Yeah.
You write about the work itself with a frank and interesting honesty. It's really refreshing. Things I never think about. Getting RSI from wanking men off for so many hours, or just like how stingy the men can be. There's this great sense of humor that you get, that I guess just like permanently exists in performing to predominantly male fantasies on an industrial scale. But you talk about the joy that can be found in the brothel, and particularly that camaraderie between the women. Also the sadness. You talk about how I love, you mentioned how the real world exists behind the closed door of the girls' room, and not where everyone is interested on the beds and the massage tables across the rest of the place. So what are the myths that are perpetuated in our culture where it comes to sex work? Like, what does film and television and all the like harrowing tell-all memoirs get wrong?
Well, so like, I mean, film and television, like, so often you like hookers are just like, like a dead body in a crime show or something. They're faceless, they're nameless. So I think like in film and television widely, like generally sex workers have been depicted as sort of passive victims. You do of course then get like salacious sort of stories like Secret Diary of a Call Girl or whatever, where it's presented as this job that brings you like great access to wealth and is incredibly thrilling and exciting and whatever. And I mean, the thing I've always said is that, the realities of sex work fall somewhere between those dichotomies. And like what I also tried to present in the book was that not only the realities of sex work for different people fall between those dichotomies, but your own day in a sex work establishment can fall between those things, because every single time you interact with someone, it's a different interaction, and you can have like a horribly awful dehumanizing interaction right next to something that's uplifting. And wait, I've lost my train of thought now. What's your full question? Yeah, so I guess like, and one of the things that I really wanted to do with this also was it show that, I think a lot of the writing around sex work has been kind of relegated to one genre, which is memoir. And like I deliberately chose like a novel format because I wanted to also show that you can write about sex work and it not be the only focal point of the novel. Like it can be a backdrop. And so like for me, like the real focuses of the novel were mental health, the queer community, the dangers of romance and infatuation. Like they were the focuses, and then sex work was just the atmospheric thing through which, the lens through which I interpreted all those other things. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's really well put. And I do want to talk more about the mental health stuff and the relationship stuff. I also want the reader to kind of experience as much of that for themselves as possible. I don't want to spoil this novel.
Oh yeah.
It's tricky. One moment that really, staying on the sex work, one moment that surprised or shocked me was a moment where a client is into a really dirty kink, and the narrator character she's not, and it's this horrifying moment for her, not necessarily because of the kink itself, but because he springs it on her, and he hasn't like negotiated this and agreed to pay for it. It's something that he's taking from her. And like in in my like repressed white male mind, I was so like shocked that it wasn't the kink that like befouled her. It was the fact that he broke that really tenuous consent that exists in that space. I guess, like, what can the world of sex work teach us about consent and like rape culture and how it's permeating Canberra and beyond?
Totally. I mean, I think sex workers would be such skilled educators when it comes to consent, because I think we view consent as this really sort of like rigid thing, like, you know, you say yes or you say no to something, right? Whereas actually consent is something that's fluid and nuanced and continues throughout an interaction with people. Like, and I think the other really important thing about consent, which we have a hyper focus on verbal consent in our society, and it's like consent is also not necessarily always verbal. It's also something that can be cued subconsciously through people's bodies. And like I know this, for example, from seeing disabled clients who can't necessarily speak, but can cue to me like their consent in other ways. And also when I see clients that don't speak English, you know, and I don't speak their language, and we have to work out consent in other ways. And so I think people really need to see consent as something that continues and has to be checked in constantly throughout interactions with people, rather than just this like stagnant thing. And I think we all need to learn to not just communicate verbally, but like to read each other's body language better in order to work out when someone is like really okay with something, you know? Yeah.
That's really well put. It's not surprising that you've written this under lockdown, because you write really lovingly about physical connection, and you write really lovingly about sweaty nightclubs. This kind of sacred space of queer culture, queer nightclubs, both in like Australia and abroad, where love and friendship and sex and revelry all kind of mixed together with thumping music and lots of heat and sweat and chemicals like MDMA and ketamine. Those spaces are just like as unknown to me as brothels are. So like, what makes them special for you as a writer? Tell me about them.
Look, I think there's two sides of it. So there's the historical significance of those spaces to me. So like you know, for very many decades, queer bars were a refuge for queer people when they couldn't meet in other spaces. And like you think of like the raids on queer bars that happened all through the 1900s, and you think of in how the for example, the mobility of like queers from regional areas moving to urban areas after the Industrial Revolution and sort of finding community for the first time, and that was generally community found around these bars. So I think, as I said, like the pandemic made, you know, digital spaces are obviously like vitally important, but I think the pandemic made us realize that digital spaces can never step in for physical spaces, and made a lot of us real, you know, like there's been a lot of, you know, like a lot of queer people don't feel connected to bar culture, you know, especially sober queer people or people who have just never liked partying or whatever, and so have felt, you know, kind of quite alienated by that world. But I think in the pandemic, I know a lot of people were like, oh, wow, that ones who'd been maybe critical or like cynical about those spaces were suddenly like, wow, those spaces actually really do serve a purpose. Even if you're not into the music or you're not into the drugs, it is just being in a room full of people, and that kind of the touch and the sort of like collective unconscious like mood that occurs in those spaces is just like really, really important. So that's that kind of like more broader historical side. But then for me personally, I've always said like I love I hate halfway spaces, in that, for example, I love being at a friend's house talking to them sober, Or I love being at a club completely fucked up and not talking to anyone, you know. But I don't like, for example, like pubs and where, you know, you're meant to drink and shout, and like I'm like, give me one or the other. And like one of the things I love about clubs is also like the anonymity that comes. Did I say that right? Anonymity. I can never say that right. Anonymity.
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 It's a tricky one.
Okay. Anyway, that like kind of comes with being in a dark space surrounded by bodies, and the moment of feeling part of a collective and transcending my body in that moment. Like, yeah.
And to be able to feel safer in that space than you would walking the street. It's it's a dichotomy. Like most people would feel the opposite.
Yeah, well, I can, at the queer clubs I go to, like I can take my clothes off and no one's going to touch me, and like I do feel a refuge from the straight male gaze, which I obviously feel so intently when I'm at work, you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
Tell me about tapping into that fluid interior world. You mentioned the Mrs. Dalloway effect earlier, and how does that relate to consumption of chemical? Like I'm thinking particularly about ketamine, which I don't have any experience with, but I hear that it makes for long, calm conversation about any and everything, and a deep, brooding, like interior moment.
Yeah, I like ketamine also because I like hallucinogens, and ketamine in certain amounts makes you hallucinate. So like I tend to push more towards like the, you know, people like scared of K-holes. I quite like K-holing. When I completely disassociate in my body and think, like, for example, I'm a glass perfume bottle that's about to shatter, you know, like I like that disorienting experience that a lot of people don't like. I do find with ketamine that it often also helps me to write, like in that I'll have realizations when I'm on ketamine, and I'll write that note down on my phone. The next day when I'm sober, I'll write about what conclusions I reach in that moment. Look, I also, just to be honest, I also wrote about drug use so much in the book because I really resent the fact that male authors are allowed to write about drug use and their writing is still taken seriously. You know, like, well, you know, like William Burroughs. Yeah, like, you know, like William Burroughs, all the beat authors, for example. And then when a woman writes about drug use, it's her book is seen as trashy, she's seen as messy, she's not taken seriously as an author. So like I deliberately put a lot of drug use in there. And also it was also a political thing because I like believe in drug decrim, but like I'm not actually like I'm largely sober these days, and like I often go to clubs completely sober. But it was there was like real intent in putting so much drug use in there.
Do you enjoy clubbing sober? Like, is it just a different kind of experience?
I feel that and this is going to sound so hippie, but I feel like when the atmosphere is right, and everyone's elated, you get completely high off the collective elation anyway. So I really do enjoy, like, I do enjoy clubbing sober. Yeah.
One place your character also searches for elation or euphoria is in the natural world, and I guess that's why the bushfires are so tragic in this novel, and just like in our lives. How do you react to a catastrophe like that as a writer, or as like a person, as a citizen?
How do I react to it? God, I mean, I feel like the way I reacted to it was by writing about it. Like I still can't think about that bushfire period without getting so distressed. Just it's like it's too hard to even think about like the state of the climate in the world. You know what I mean? Like it feels.
Yeah, I get what you're talking about. It's for I think at least a lot of people in our generation and the next, it's kind of this just permanent state of distress.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And it makes it makes it hard to compartmentalize your life in the scheme of things, and it makes it hard
Yeah.
to imagine a long-term future
Yeah.
in a lot of ways.
I will say that was the sorry to interrupt you.
Mm.
I was just going to say that was the hardest. That day was the hardest day to write. Like I ended up like writing all the others and had to go back, and like it was really, really difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like a lot happens in this 8 days.
Yeah.
I still like I describe it as a novel of ideas. I reread the first chapter this morning, and even just there, the whole thing kicks off with your character asking an octogenarian client to take photos of her, and it just invites this rumination over like, why do we photograph ourselves, and why do we share photos, and then like that invites like thinking about social media and how that will censor nipples and words like, keywords like brothel or porn or prostitute, in the name of kind of like family friendly content. But at the same time, it's running this algorithm that's trying to push you to do the most like risque post possible in order to be seen and acknowledged and be seen as good. How like social media is, like your Insta is like a big part of how you share your ideas and your writing. So how do you feel about that?
Look, I think Instagram's dying. I think I've used social media platforms as kind of like empires, that thing that every empire eventually falls. Like I think Facebook has fallen, and now Instagram and Twitter are dying. And I think we're having the rise of TikTok, and then eventually TikTok will die. I feel really grateful to have grown up in an age before censorship and algorithms and advertising ruined the internet. Like when I first really became into the internet as like, as like a 12-year-old was when I first started, RPGing online and getting really into like corners of the internet. I loved the fact that it was sort of decentralized. You had like niche forums in which you met with people. There was like, it was a fucking free-for-all, and like, yes, it meant that I was sending nudes to older men when I was 14, and like, yes, it meant that I was seeing videos of people being beheaded online, but also it was complete chaos. Like the world was complete chaos, whereas now like the internet is fucking sectioned off and like into these territories that like corporations can just like crow over and exert their own rules and morality over, and I hate that has happened to the internet. So for me, what I'm like, I kind of hope that we're coming into a time where we will see the death of these big social media platforms and the rise once again of decentralized internet, where people moderate forums not for income, and like a separation from advertising. I don't know if that actually happened, but I hope that's the kind of internet that we will return to. So yeah,
it sounds like utopian almost, but that was 5 years ago, right?
It wasn't 5 years ago though. Like it's more like 10 years ago now. Yeah. I feel like when the internet was like that. Look, so I have a complicated relationship with Instagram because obviously I've used the platform for many things, but the platform at the end of the day, I exist so tenuously there. I've had my Instagram deleted a number of times. Like I always have posts deleted. I have to be careful with what I say. And to be honest, I am looking forward to the day when I can no longer exist, no longer have to rely on Instagram in any sort of way, and can just have my words in like hard copy that can't be taken away by a corporation. But look, I've recently started using the dark web. So like, I feel like I'm moving to new spaces of the internet anyway. I'm like, woo.
Oh, dude. All right. Well, I have to get on the dark web now.
Yeah, that's where everyone's going to go.
Or at least just read more of your books. This is the first novel. But you are writing more?
Yeah, I've written the second one. I just finished that. It's a magical
It's
realism
really
novel.
different, isn't it?
Yeah, so different. It's like more traditional. It's a traditional novel structure, so it's like third person past tense. It's set in around like 2009. So actually that era of the internet in which I was just like describing. And it's a magical realism novel set in northern New South Wales. That draws on like Scottish mythology as like a parallel for sort of dysfunctional like mother-daughter relationships. It was really fun to write. I really loved writing it. Yeah.
Will you publish that with Alan and Unwin as well?
I actually don't know. At the moment, it's with my
Waiting
agent.
to sort out
so I can't.
the detail.
I mean, touch wood. We'll see. It's with my agent right now. She really likes it. And we will take some steps beyond that. Yeah.
I'm excited.
Yeah.
This book is brilliant. And it already has this book, Nothing But My Body, is brilliant. It already has like terrific endorsements from some really cool people. And as we sort of said, you already have this big following that you've cultivated over the years. What do you want to achieve with this book?
Oh, okay. So this book, I feel like I wanted to prove to myself that I could write a book. Because I've tried in the past. Yeah, like I've tried when I was 15 and like, you know what I mean? I've tried many times. And so this was and I wanted to write a book that played to my strengths. Which is why I went like the sort of like flow of like consciousness, like first person, because that's what my Instagram has always been and that's what people have followed me for. So this book was very much playing to my strength, proving that I could do it to myself, and also giving my followers what they like to hear from me, you know, whereas this second book I've written is more what I wanted to write, you know what I mean, or what I would read as a reader, because like I'm at the end of the day, like I'm not into the book that, I mean, obviously like I can't like I'm not going to say anything bad about my own book, but like this is not the book I would choose to read. Like I like personally like more traditional fiction. I really like fantasy. I really like sci-fi. I'm not particularly into auto fiction. So I mean, probably my agent and publisher maybe they don't want me to say that, but like
no, I think that's a really interesting thing to say. Nothing But My Body, I probably would not have picked it up on its like description alone had it not been for your name and hearing about you and the really interesting following that you have, and like just knowing you as someone who has a lot of valuable things to say. It's a tricky path to tread. But I'm recommending this book to everyone. I'm saying like for a lot of people, this book will be a challenge, not because it's a massive tome or because it is vulgar, but it's confronting, and it's going to be something that's just a wildly different point of view to so many people, and that's why a fiction like this is valuable. I really appreciate your time today, Tilly.
Oh, thank you. We're wrapping up.
I think we will.
Yeah, good. That went so fast. I'm going to be able to
let me finish up by asking one more question. At the top of the podcast, I asked about your headspace writing Nothing But My Body, and you said you wrote it in lockdown. What's your headspace now in lockdown once again?
Oh God, I mean, my lockdown headspace has been up and down. I will say the first 3 weeks were really fucked and I was really depressed and I couldn't do anything, and that was making me feel more depressed. The last week has actually been better because of book promo stuff keeping me occupied, so I feel like I at least have a purpose and I'm productive or whatever. And I know like obviously I hate the idea of like value being tied to productivity and like capitalist culture, but at the end of the day I personally do feel better about myself when I'm productive. So I'm having a good week this week because I'm busy with this stuff. Yeah, so like thank you for having me as well. Like as I said, it gives some structure to my day.
We'll do this again.
Yeah. Perfect.
Nothing But My Body is published by Allen and Unwin. You can buy it online at booktopia.com.au.
Thank you for listening to the Booktopia podcast channel. Don't forget, you can subscribe to us on SoundCloud and iTunes for free and get access to hundreds of author discussions, book analysis pieces, and more. Or, if your eyes need a workout, head to Booktopia TV on YouTube. Don't forget, for all books featured in this podcast and for access to a whole bunch of other fun content on our blog, head to Booktopia, Australia's local bookstore, at booktopia.com.au.